Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, the former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, who's my guest today, is the first senior UPA leader to write a book which substantially covers the 10 years of the UPA in office. And here it is. It's called Backstage, the story behind India's high growth years. The book will be available in bookshops from Saturday the 15th, but today Mr. Ahluwalia is giving me his first interview. Montek Ahluwalia, you write of the UPA decade. The performance of this government in the first 7 of its 10 years was outstanding. Give me 2 or 3 achievements that justify the use of that adjective outstanding.
Well, I think the most important of those is really what happened to the growth rate. You know, over the years, the book covers much more than the UPA. We've been trying to get the economy from being slow growing to fast growing. And it is in the UPA years that for the first 7 years, we average a growth rate of 8.4%. This had never happened before, and it's never happened since. So that's the first one. Second, it wasn't just growth. We were very concerned that the growth needed to be inclusive. And that actually meant, A, doing a better job in agriculture, which actually we did. The agricultural performance in the UPA period was much better than the past and better than since. And second, a number of programs that were specifically aimed at improving incomes of the poor. And this is reflected in what happened to poverty. I mean, this is the first period when absolute poverty in India declined. And about 140 million people were pulled above the poverty line between 2004 and 2011.
And
that's
that
important.
figure of 138 million being pulled above the poverty line is an achievement that I believe was internationally recognized at the time. It had never happened before, and as you say, it hasn't happened since.
Yes, I mean, earlier the percentage of the population below the poverty line was going down, but the absolute number was increasing because population was expanding.
This is the first time the absolute number went down.
Yes, absolutely.
And it went down, as you write in your book, by 138 million.
Yes, that's the exact number.
So would I be right in saying that this economic achievement, the 8.4% average growth rate for the first 7 years, which led to a 138 million decline in poverty, is the achievement you believe is the best achievement of the UPA years?
Well, one of the best. I mean, I think there were other important achievements also. I mean, one is, apart from poverty, institutional changes, bringing in the right to education, right to information. I think that was a very important institutional change. And also on putting health and education much more on the national agenda. I mean, these are long-term movements where improvement will take time. But I think it was firmly put on the government agenda that the central government must do more in these areas, which are actually state government areas.
Then explain this to me. How do you account for the fact that a government whose performance for the first 7 years you said was outstanding crashed out in disgrace 3 years later?
Well, I mean, that's a good question, and I do address the issue. You know, in any 10-year period, you expect to have swings of ups and downs. The downswing that began after 2011, part of it was the result of a global downswing because you had a major crisis, the Eurozone crisis. I think domestically, we ran up against new constraints, particularly regulatory constraints that held up approvals for large projects. Now, this was partly because on the environment front, I mean, the government wanted to do a better job on environment, but the regulatory system wasn't geared to clear indications about what's necessary and what's not.
So you're suggesting...
There was also, by the way, a lot of suspicion of private sector.
I'll go into that more now, but you're suggesting that the reason you crashed out in disgrace is because you ran up, in a sense, against the buffers. International economic slowdowns and problems hit you at one end, and domestic concerns hit you in the other. You got squeezed between the two.
That's certainly true, and I think it's also true that the allegations of corruption, which were linked to the lack of clarity on policy in certain areas, created an environment in which the government came out poorly. And I don't think it handled that very well.
Actually, it's the handling of that I want to explore with you. You say in your book that the UPA's response to the allegations of corruption which emerged first from 2G and then from Colgate was not just inadequate but possibly inept. You were accused of selling cheaply and as a result causing a whopping loss to the exchequer. But as you point out in your book, there were extremely good reasons why you could justify selling cheaply. To paraphrase your argument, you say, there was a clear logic behind selling at a lower price. It would stimulate the growth of telecom, which would lead to faster GDP growth and in turn additional revenue, which would in turn be used for development purposes. If that credible defense had been made, do you think the image with which UPA collapsed might have been avoided?
Well, I think certainly it would have been. Mind you, when you say would have been made, the Prime Minister said that very explicitly in the Lok Sabha. See, the issue was not whether we could have sold the spectrum for a little more money. I've no doubt we could. Although I believe that the numbers identified as the possible realization were probably exaggerated. The question was whether by selling it cheaper and attracting more players into the system, you accelerated the pace of expansion. Now,
not just of telecom, but also the impact on GDP growth and therefore revenues for development.
Exactly. And I make that point that a serious effort to judge the benefits of this has to be based on making an assessment on all these things.
You make that point very credibly. You make that point very credibly in the book. But my question is, why was this defense, which is such a convincing defense, not made more effectively at the time?
Well, I mean, as I said, it was made. The Prime Minister said it. You know, Kapil Sibal, for example, made the point that, look, we could always make more money by selling water at a higher price, and we could probably do that, but there are benefits from selling it at a lower price. So the point was made,
right, that
but didn't get into the political discourse.
And that's the problem. You see, the Prime Minister made it once. He made it in an academic way. He did it in Parliament where he wasn't necessarily picked up. And let's be honest, he's not the most effective and convincing speaker when he's trying to defend something that is being questioned. Kapil did it just once. His zero-loss theory got ridiculed, sadly, and he never did it again. And yet this is a convincing defense if it was made effectively. That's very important. It could have actually carried the day. Who at the end of the day is responsible for not putting across a defense that could have won?
No, I share your view that a better defense, a better explanation should have been given. Probably it should have been given more in the political sphere. One of the problems, by the way, was that debate in Parliament was somehow stymied because the opposition at the time sort of held up the functioning of Parliament, insisting on a joint committee.
But your ministers should have come out on television and made it. Your spokesman should have made it. And what I'm saying is the political party, the Congress should have made it. And this was a political act to do, which the party, your ministers, sadly from the PM downwards, failed to do. You had a good defense, it could carry the day, but you never made it and you lost the game.
Well, I agree that the full defense, which I think would have made people think, was not made. Now, since I wasn't engaged in political management, I can't say what actually.
Quite right. Political players, ministers, spokesmen should have done it, they didn't.
Yes, and I think but we need a lesson in this, or more importantly for the future. You know, we should stop continually focusing on possibilities of corruption, derailing more serious discussions on policy. I mean, the most important thing we should have said is that if you took a poll at that time, what is the service where ordinary people have experienced the maximum benefit?
That's telecom.
It's telecom. And that should have been brought out.
But again, the facts were entirely in your favor. You increased telecom density, mobile phone ownership, as well as you reduced the price at which mobile connectivity happened hugely. None of that was effectively put across. I know it was mentioned in papers, I know it was written about by columnists, but that's very different to a credible political defense made by a convincing politician, pushed through by a political party. That's where the government, its ministers, and the parties that form the government let the government down.
I think it's fair to say that the government didn't get the best deal that they could have. Now, one possibility is that, you know, when a particular ministry is run by one member of a coalition, maybe there's a tendency for everybody to step back and let that minister
You mean you waited for the DMK and Raja to make the defense?
I can't say because I have no idea.
But Kapil made the defense after Raja had gone, but having made it once and having been ridiculed wrongly because he talked of zero loss, he never made it again. And The point that I'm making is that you had a good, convincing defense, which should have been made, and if it had been, you would not necessarily have crashed out in disgrace. You may still have lost,
Yeah.
but you wouldn't have ended in disgrace.
Well,
and you agree.
I say
you agree.
well, let me say I agree in the sense, and I say in the book, the defense was made in Parliament but just not picked up. So really, somewhere
and the right
between
person
making
to make
that
the defense from the priority point of view is the Prime Minister, but from the point of view of convincing the country, it's not. He's not the best speaker. You would have needed other people to convince the country, but the others weren't there to do it.
Well, whoever you chose to be the spokesman, perhaps the minister then concerned, other people, a much, much better case should have been made, in my view.
The second thing your book brings out is an explanation for why UPA didn't get the credit for many of its achievements. You write, Manmohan Singh never bragged about his achievements. He genuinely believed it was best to let the results speak for themselves. But because neither he nor his party projected these achievements, they were never formed part of the political discourse. So Manmohan Singh's reticence, modesty, silence and shyness cost UPA recognition of its achievements. He should have banged the drum more. Other ministers should have banged the drum, but they didn't, and people thought you hadn't achieved very much.
Well, you know, there's something positive about a personality that doesn't brag. So we need to look a little deeper. I mean, what is it about our media, press, the pundits, who couldn't see the fact that this is not a person who's going to brag about his achievements? Let's have a look at those achievements. And those achievements, as I've said, were phenomenal, at least the first 7 years.
You're blaming the media for not on its own looking at the achievements, and perhaps the media should have scrutinized your achievements. But the truth is, in every country, and this is not unusual, it's part of democratic functioning, ministers spend a lot of time telling the public about what they've achieved. Just look at the BJP and Narendra Modi. They don't stop boasting about what they've done. In fact, they claim credit for what the UPA did, Jan Dhan and Aadhaar being examples. Instead, you had credible achievements. You didn't boast about them. The Prime Minister was silent, and as a result, no one realized that you'd actually done an awful lot.
I think it's fair to say that, you know, the government of the day did not, at that time, in the last couple of years, did not get the credit due for these very substantial achievements. I mean, you mentioned...
Because they didn't talk about them.
Possibly. I mean, telecom, Aadhaar, we called it financial inclusion, it's now called Jan Dhan. But these three linked together are the basic groundwork on which the tremendous digitalization of the economy and fintech and all the rest of it is happening, and it's good that it's happening.
And
but
these are foundations laid by UPA.
Absolutely.
And UPA failed to sing about them, and so the song was never heard.
Well, that's a graphic description, but it's probably fair to say that the song wasn't heard, at least not during the election campaign.
In fact, even the Congress party, which presumably is a political animal, didn't actually claim credit for raising 138 million out of poverty, something that had never happened before. You say in your book that you were puzzled by this, but the truth is, this is a case of a political party not behaving politically.
Well, it is, in my view, it is a pity that the system, the party, the system, did not take credit for this. Now remember, the Prime Minister said it frequently. Mrs. Gandhi also said it on a couple of occasions that, you know, poverty has gone down. But what it is that translates, that makes that get into the political discourse...
is the figure.
...is the key issue. And, you know, I have no way of knowing what failed to make that happen.
We're reaching a very interesting half conclusion. On this question of corruption, 2G and Colgate, you had a good defense. It was made weakly by the Prime Minister in Parliament, not picked up. It was made once by Kapil Sibal, and he was then ridiculed and he forgot it. But it was nonetheless a credible defense. And if you had the spokesman, if you had the talented people to speak about it, you could have actually changed the image, but it didn't happen. And the second half conclusion we're reaching is that you had some credible achievements, but neither the Prime Minister nor the party bragged about them. You raised 138 million people out of poverty, but Congress didn't claim credit for it. And once again, as a result, because you didn't boast, your achievements went unrecognized.
Well, I mean, I totally agree with you that those were major achievements. I also have to agree that they didn't get recognized. So somewhere there was obviously a failing.
Let's then at this point come to three specific issues during the UPA years which were matters of great concern, and you write about all of them, and I'd like to take you through each of them one by one. You hinted at the first one I'm mentioning. Industrialists repeatedly complained that environmental regulations and pressure from NGOs, often working in association with or alongside the National Advisory Council, led to project clearances being delayed, sometimes substantially delayed, and as a result, investment, industry, development and growth also got delayed. And in your book you suggest this is not an unjustified complaint.
Well, I don't mention the National Advisory Council in this context. I mean, there's civil society. You know, let me step back a little, because I think the environment issue is very critical, and all those problems continue. It's not as if they've got resolved. I think what we had is an environmental regulation, a system of environmental regulations that was totally non-transparent. I mean, you could interpret it in whichever way you liked. With the rise of civil society being, in my view, legitimately concerned that too much of investment projects, etc., were not observing what was necessary for the environment, you had a system which quickly stopped whatever permissions were given. Now, in an environment where civil society is able to go to court, I think you need great clarity in your environmental regulations so that you could clearly say, yes, this meets it, and yes, this doesn't.
In fact,
that was a problem.
I'm going to quote from your book. You say two very important things. First, you say, Indian law permits anyone to approach the courts and seek a stay on a project on grounds of public interest. That means that industrialists became terribly vulnerable to NGOs, in fact, to any general busybody. And the second thing you say is we did not have a sufficiently robust system of granting environmental clearances that would stand up to a subsequent scrutiny. Now, that's a clear case of the government not putting something in place, and because you failed to put it in place, it became a problem for industry. Why at least did you not tackle the second? Why did you not put in place a robust system of clearance?
No, I think that's not something which you just do at the stroke of a pen.
But you had 10 years to do it.
It takes a certain amount of time.
But you had 10 years.
No, but you know, the environmental issue became really serious only around about 2010, 2011. It just wasn't there in the early stages. So it's around 2010, 11 that it became a problem. And I think, you know...
Can I interrupt? Are you suggesting that it became a problem towards the end of your tenure, and it took you a while to become certain that it was a problem and to understand, and therefore you're suggesting you didn't have time to tackle it before 2014 came and you were voted out?
Well, I can't say that I was directly aware of the details of these things, so I wasn't dealing with it. But I do think that it was in 2010, 2011, that the problem began to surface. The problem at that stage, by the way, was that there was a genuine concern that environmental issues were not being adequately reflected. Maybe the regulatory authorities were also sort of more what they used to call driven by development objectives. So, you know, in any system where tensions arise, it takes a couple of years to work out what to do.
That's your answer. It takes a couple of years to work out what to do. You only became aware of this environmental obstacle 2010 to 11, and before those couple of years, you were out of office. So in other words, you didn't have enough time to tackle the problem.
I think in the case of environment, the big achievement was to sanctify the importance of environmental issues. We didn't have enough time to tackle the problem, and I'm not sure that the problem has been tackled even now, because you need much greater expertise and clarity. You also need courts recognizing that, look, if a permission has been given, you shouldn't kind of overturn it. I mean, an investor asks for permission. It's not the investor's job to make sure that that permission is validly given. But if 5 years later somebody overturns that permission, it's a huge cost.
But the pity is that the government by 2010 to 11 was aware the problem existed, and I'm simply questioning, is it really necessary for you to have taken 2-3 more years to decide what to do? Would you not have acted earlier? Is there not a certain measure of responsibility you have to accept because you were slow to respond?
You should always accept that we should have done things faster. But I mean, in this particular case, not only didn't we do things fast enough, I think these problems still persist.
Absolutely. The second issue of concern that arose during the UPAs is the Land Acquisition Act. You seem to accept, and I'm quoting from your book, that it increased the cost of land to financially unsustainable levels and made it easier for anyone wanting to stop a project to use the various consultative processes required under the law to delay matters. And this continues to be, by the way, a huge cause of complaint even 7 years later. So would you accept that although this act may have been put in place with the most noble and laudable intentions, as far as investment, industry, development and growth are concerned, it was a bad mistake?
I think at that point, the overwhelming perception was that the acquisition of land is taking place at very, very low rates, and there's no doubt about that. So I think it was right that we tried to change the law. But I don't think we got it right how to do it.
You got it horribly wrong, some would say.
Well, you know, in these matters, that's what, when the election took place, the BJP said that they were going to repeal this law or amend it.
They tried.
They didn't get
They
success.
tried, but they didn't succeed. But the point is, in 2013, which is when you were putting it in place, there were a lot of people, economists, journalists, commentary, industrialists in particular, saying, you're going too far, you're overcorrecting. Yeah. But you didn't pay heed to their advice.
No, I think it was mainly on the economist side. By the way, there were very few people actually objecting.
Industrialists were complaining.
But industrialists were complaining. But you know, they're seen as a stakeholder on the other side. I think
that
frankly,
sounds as if you had good reason to be dismissive, and it turns out you were wrong to be dismissive.
No, I mean, anybody who's building a project obviously wants to acquire the land at the cheapest possible rate.
But today you agree that you made the land too expensive.
I think the difference really is that, you know, there was a serious issue here, that if it's a private sector project, why does the land have to be acquired? I mean, you should just buy it at the market rate and operate on that basis. To use public sector power, sort of a preemptive power of the state, to acquire land forcibly for a private sector project is a questionable issue.
But we're not talking about acquiring land forcibly. We're talking about the laws you put in place which made the acquisition of land, even by private parties for industry, as you say, financially unsustainable. And secondly, you say that you made it easier for anyone wanting to stop a project to use the various consultative process required under the law to delay matters.
Yes,
so you made it, on the one hand, far too expensive to acquire land, and you made it a lot easier for any busybody to put obstacles in the way and hold it up. On both ends, you made a problem for industry.
I think, you know, these are the unintended consequences of well-meaning legislative action.
But actually, were they unintended? Because you had industrialists warning you about this right through the time. You just didn't listen to them.
No,
you thought they were stakeholders and dismissed them.
No, I don't think that's true. I think people genuinely felt that you had to move the bar a little more in favor of the landowners.
But you moved it far too much.
It went too far. That's true.
You concede that.
But you know, in my view, what we need, and I say this even today and for the future, we need to stop viewing legislative changes as somehow highly politicized and not capable of review.
In an ideal world,
we need to do that.
In an ideal world, that would be true, but
Yeah.
neither you nor I live in one. And the point I'm making is that you today concede you moved the bar too far.
I think
You today concede you made the price of land financially unsustainable. You today concede that for anyone wanting to stop the project, you made it far too easy for them to do so. But all of this was actually advised and suggested to you by industry at the time. You didn't listen. Now, I take your point. You see them as stakeholders, but at least with hindsight, you should accept you should have been more receptive to what they were saying.
No, by the way, the final formula for determining the price of land was made more flexible as a result precisely of these sorts of
nowhere near flexible enough. And that's the problem.
You know, even there, let me say that...
Let's not quibble about this. You conceded, because your book says it, I'm simply quoting your book, that you made the price of land financially unsustainable and you made it far too easy for people to put obstacles. As a result, industry suffered.
That's certainly what industry feels today. And on the whole, I would agree that, you know, it has made it more difficult. Now, whether it's just the cost or the procedure.
Both.
And it's the procedure, actually, which I think is very cumbersome.
Let's come to the third issue of concern that occurred during the UPAs. I'm talking about the decision to amend the Income Tax Act retrospectively, 50 years after it was passed, to overturn the Supreme Court's Vodafone judgment. Now, at the time, you were Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, and I interviewed you for the program Devil's Advocate, and you defended the decision. I'm going to quote what you said. That particular change is not only appropriate, it's something they signaled in the Direct Access Code that they were going to do. In your book, however, you say this was a self-inflicted wound. You add, as a result, investor sentiment suffered a major blow. So my question is simple. Have you changed your view since 2012? Or were you deliberately hiding the truth when you spoke to me in 2012?
No, I think I'm sure what I meant when I spoke to you was that the direction of change is not illogical. That is, direct and indirect capital gains should be taken into account. What was problematic was
doing it
interpreting it retrospectively to overcome a Supreme Court decision. Now, my view was that if you want to make this change, there's nothing wrong with making it prospectively.
But not retrospectively.
Although even that creates sort of, you have to have a de minimis clause, because if somebody buys a company abroad which has 10 shares in an Indian company, I'm not sure that you want to reopen these things. But my point was, therefore, prospectively, everybody would understand. Retrospectively, I didn't think it was right.
In fact, in your book, you reveal that you advised Pranab Mukherjee, who's finance minister at the time, not to do it retrospectively. You told him, and I'm quoting you, if we want to impose capital gains tax on indirect transfers, we should amend the law prospectively. A retroactive amendment to overcome a Supreme Court judgment would have negative effects. He didn't listen to you. Why was he obstinate on this issue?
Where was?
He obstinate on this issue.
Well, I don't know what went on between the finance minister. You know, the budget is a very secret affair. I was asked to give my view before the decision was taken, and I made it very plain. What went into the pros and cons, I can only speculate.
Let me ask you this. You were asked your view by the finance minister, and you made it very plain that this is the wrong step. Did you, in fact, say to the Prime Minister, who eventually is the deciding authority in the government, that what's being proposed is a very silly move?
Well, this was being much talked about at the time. It was not that I had any secret information. And my recollection is that I did inform the Prime Minister that I hope they don't do it. And I told him, I've told the Finance Minister my views. Now, what happened after that, I have no idea. But, you know, I can imagine...
It's very interesting, because this is not in your book. You did inform the Prime Minister that this is being talked about, and you did say to the Prime Minister, I hope they don't do it. And yet they did it.
Well, you know, the process by which budget decisions are taken doesn't involve other people even in the cabinet.
But I'm interrupting you because there's only one obvious corollary and consequence of what you said. You informed the Prime Minister this is being considered. You gave him your advice that this would be the wrong thing to do. And if it still happened, then only two things can follow. Either that the Prime Minister disagreed with you, didn't think this was the bad thing to do, in which case the Prime Minister's judgment comes into call. And remember, he was a former finance minister and a renowned economist. Or the Prime Minister agreed with you, but didn't overrule his finance minister, and which leads to people to say he was a bit weak. Why did he not overrule the finance minister?
I have no information or basis for judging what went on between the finance minister and the Prime Minister, because I wasn't there. But, you know, I think I can well imagine the compulsions on the finance minister to push the case, because if the Revenue Department come before you and say that, look, we've won a case in the Delhi High Court. So the factual
but you lost it in the Supreme Court.
But then they... And
not just lost it once, you lost it on review as well.
I think the critical thing is, I don't know exactly what the Revenue Department's argument was, which won the day.
You're talking about the pressure that the Revenue Department would have put on the Finance Minister. I want to ask a different question. The Prime Minister was aware what was being proposed. He's a former Finance Minister. He's probably one of this country's most highly reputable economists. Did he not know that what the Finance Minister is proposing to do would be terrible? It would send out a discouraging message. It would put off investors. He must have known that.
I think this is where, if he writes his own book, no doubt he'll give you some sense of what the issues were. I can't speak for him on this one.
When you spoke to him, did he give you any sense that he agreed with your view?
No. I mean, because this was well before the matters would have gone further beyond the finance ministry. So it was a bit early in the day. I was just informing him that this is what I've said to the finance minister.
Which brings me back to what I said earlier. Once he was informed that the finance minister was thinking of this, and he still let it happen, only two conclusions are possible. One, that he believed what the finance minister was doing was okay, it wasn't a problem. And as I said, that calls the Prime Minister's judgment into question. Or he felt too weak to overrule his finance minister. Now, that's a very strange and worrying conclusion.
You know, you're pushing me into making a comment about something that I don't know about. In this, I don't know what happened.
I'm just simply raising the issue that either the Prime Minister's judgment comes into question or his weakness comes into question.
Again, you know, since I don't know exactly what the criteria were that were put forward when these issues were discussed, I wasn't there. It's quite possible that they were viewed as matters of detail. I mean, I have no idea.
One other question.
One thing I want to mention.
Afterwards, did you ever say to the Prime Minister,
one thing I want to mention.
On reflection, do you agree a mistake was made? You've been open enough to admit it in your book. Has the Prime Minister, not at the time, but a couple of years later, admitted to you that this was a mistake, we shouldn't have done?
No, this is not something that I've discussed with the Prime Minister. I mean, because it's obviously an issue that he has to speak about if he wishes to speak about.
My last question before I take a break, I want to put to you a charge that the NDA repeatedly makes about your government. They say you left office with huge non-performing assets in public sector banks. And they say this was because either you indulged in what they call telephone banking, or as the finance minister said in Chennai on Saturday, everyone's uncle and brother-in-law was given loans. How do you respond to that?
Well, look, there's no doubt that there was a big expansion in lending, public sector bank lending, during a boom period. You know, in any economy, when you have a boom, a great expansion in investment, etc., public sector lending bank lending increases. And if you've got a banking system which is 70% public sector bank lending increases. You know, I think that what went wrong with those, I don't believe that each of those loans was the result of interference and cronyism and so on. Though
was some loans a result of interference and cronyism?
You can never be sure. But what I'm saying is that to say that the entire process of financial support that led to 8.4% growth was a disaster is just wrong. Now, what is true is that when the economy slows down, okay, loans that were given for projects that assumed a high growth become difficult to service.
This is the consequence of the economy slowing down.
And that's continued.
But you do concede, although only half rhetorically, that there could have been some loans that were a result of what the government today calls telephone banking.
Well, I have no evidence for that. I mean, the difference between honest mistakes, incompetence, and cronyism, I mean, you can only do a forensic search or examination to see what went wrong. But it's certainly true that many of the loans given in that period turned non-performing. However, you also have to ask the question that the nature of banking sector stress was pretty evident by about 2015. We haven't actually done very much to solve that problem.
Which is of course correct, but it's a different issue.
That's a different issue.
But you do concede that there were sizable NPAs left for the successor government when you demitted office in 2014. But you're saying that these were not all or even majority bad loans given for cronyism. They were a result of the economy slowing down, and projects which looked healthy when the rate of growth was higher now looked unhealthy because the rate of growth had come down.
Yes, that's absolutely correct.
Let's take a break at that point.
And by the way, historically, there have been periods when NPAs have gone up and through better management, they've come down.
It's just your bad luck that you left office when NPAs were rising.
Well, you could put it that way, but I think they could have been brought down faster, earlier, and corrective action taken much better.
Let's take a break at that point. So far, we've discussed what I call are the economic aspects of the UPA mentioned in your book. When I come back, I want to turn to some of the political issues that you yourself discuss. First, we're going to take a break and a message from our sponsor, Glenlivet, whilst I take a sip of this.
Take a little trip with me, I'm gonna take you home.
Take a little history.
Take a little
down this lane of memories.
down this lane.
So let's raise another glass for the glorious past and the friends we have become. Yeah, 'cause little did we know The good times come and go, but the best is yet to come.
Welcome back to a special interview for The Wire with Montek Singh Ahluwalia, the former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission and the first member of the UPA government to have written a book that covers in great detail the UPA's 10 years in power. And here it is. It's called Backstage, the story behind India's high growth years. The book is going to be available in stores to buy from Saturday the 15th, but this is Mr. Ahluwalia's first interview. I want to turn Montek Singh Ahluwalia now to political issues that you write about, and to begin with a particular incident that probably everyone remembers: Rahul Gandhi publicly tearing up the Manmohan Singh ordinance. Now, you discuss it in your book from the standpoint, was this an issue over which the Prime Minister should have resigned because it degraded the office of the PM? I want to ask you a different question. What about Rahul Gandhi's behavior? Was it fitting that the Vice President of the ruling Congress party should have behaved in public in this way? And did it not reveal his immaturity and his reckless impetuosity?
Well, there's no way that I can answer those questions. I mean, I've said
You
in
have
my
an
book-
opinion.
No, I mean, politics is about people expressing their opinions in different contexts. And I don't think that we should impose rigid standards on what somebody can do in a I mean, you know.
You don't think it revealed immaturity and reckless impetuosity?
Well, I think I've said in the book that he later on expressed some regret about the form of words used. But, you know, the basic decision, the basic substantive issue that he was taking was that the ordinance that the government was considering would be seen by people as only favoring those who had been convicted of corruption.
There's no doubt
He
that
had
the
some public
ordinance was
support there.
morally questionable. But the manner in which he made his objection known not only brought his own behavior into ridicule, it embarrassed the Prime Minister and it embarrassed the government. And as a result, how he made his protest known became the focus of attention rather than the substance of the protest. Which is why I'm saying, is this a mature way for a Vice President of a ruling party to behave?
Well, since I'm not a member of any political party, I can't comment on how different
But you're a
personalities
thinking
should.
human being who wrote a book
Well,
which
look,
mentions this, and I'm asking your opinion. Why won't you express your opinion? Do you, Montek Ahluwalia, think Rahul Gandhi's behavior was appropriate?
Well, he has himself said that he felt.
But
the
what's
words-
your view?
But let me say that.
What's your view? He may have said whatever.
No,
What's your view?
I mean, since he says that his words were inappropriate, a better expression of those same sentiments would have been better. But the key point is this. To my mind, in a political party, if a senior member of the political party happens to disagree with what the coalition government is doing, I don't think it's particularly wrong to express that view in public.
It's how you express it, and it's whether you throw the Prime Minister into ridicule when he's abroad and make him actually look silly outside India that is the cause of concern. But leave that aside. You go one step further. You say, I had always felt it would have been much better if Rahul had agreed to join the cabinet. You say it would have created a greater sense of political cohesion. But if Rahul had done what he did, tearing up in public an ordinance, when he was a cabinet minister, it would have been a lot worse. Surely this, and I use this phrase advisedly, this bull in a china shop was better outside the china shop rather than inside the cabinet.
Well, by the way, a factual position, he didn't actually tear up anything on television. I know that all of you gentlemen have created
He tore it up at a press conference in the Press Club of India, and people saw him tearing it up.
No, if
He
you-
tore up the sheets of paper,
He-
and the cameras were there covering it.
What I saw is he didn't tear up. What he said is the ordinance should
forgive
be
me,
torn up.
he actually tore it up. The whole country saw it. It was repeated endlessly on television. Your memory may be at fault, but it was seen, it was repeated, and
I've actually seen that YouTube thing.
it
and
was
there
on
is no
television.
tearing up.
It was on television. He was
I need to
tearing it
check.
up. He tore it up. I assure you.
Okay, well,
He
but
he tore it up.
he did say it should be.
But
torn
what
up.
about my
That's-
question? Should a person who can tear up government documents in public, embarrass the Prime Minister, embarrass the government, actually be a member of the cabinet? Because if he did it as a cabinet minister, it would be a lot worse.
Look, my view on that is that as clearly an extremely important member, senior member of the Congress party, his presence in the cabinet would have strengthened the functioning of the cabinet, given an internal opportunity to express views within the cabinet, and would have made things better.
What about
That's
something
my
else?
view.
Would it not have created two power centers in cabinet? And would that not have undermined the Prime Minister? Remember, you're not talking about just an important member of the party, you're talking about the Gandhi family scion, who's seen as the next heir to the throne.
No, that would have had an impact both ways, in the sense that his presence in the cabinet would have enabled him to express his views. Others would have listened to his views. You would not have a situation where views were being expressed from outside. So my personal
Yes, but the
view,
problem
my
is that
personal
once he
view
was
is
sitting
it
in
would have-
cabinet,
yeah.
many cabinet ministers would have waited to hear what Rahul has to say before they took a stand on an issue.
You know-
and the Prime Minister's view would have been subordinate to Rahul's. And therefore the PM would have been undermined.
No, I don't think so. I think, in any well-functioning political system, you're mixing and merging different views. Therefore, if you have an important voice in the party, it's much better that that voice is inside.
Then outside.
I don't think that's
Let
a
me ask you
problem
two
at
quick
all.
questions about Rahul Gandhi. I'm not sure you'll answer them. What opinion did you form of Rahul Gandhi as a politician during the 10 years of the UPA government?
I've had very little opportunity to actually interact with him, so I can't comment on him as a politician. But, as I said, my dominant impression during that period was that as a very important member of the largest party in the coalition, it would have been much better if he had been in the cabinet. I know the Prime Minister was very keen to bring him in, and I always said, look,
we've
it'll be great.
discussed. That we've discussed. Do you think Rahul Gandhi has the qualities to be Prime Minister of India one day?
I mean, these are issues that the day he gets a large political following and gets support, everybody will say he has the qualities to become Prime Minister. I mean, that in politics, the ultimate test is how much support do you get. So good luck. I mean, everybody who wants to be in politics
other
should
words,
test him out.
If and when he's in a position to be Prime Minister, people will see the qualities necessary in him. Till then, they may not. But that doesn't mean to say he doesn't have them.
Yeah, I think so.
You really are a diplomat. My last issue. I want to talk to you about Dr. Manmohan Singh. You worked with him very closely in the UPA government for 10 years. You worked with him earlier when he was Finance Minister and you were Finance Secretary and Commerce Secretary. By the time Dr. Manmohan Singh handed over power in 2014, he was widely viewed as weak, vacillating, and some people even said he was clinging to power at the cost of his dignity. You worked closely, you have an inside view. Was that image with which he left office inaccurate and unfair, or would you say some of it may be accurate?
I think it was inaccurate, actually, because I think there's no question that when he was Finance Minister, nobody would have called him weak and vacillating, but there he had very clear idea of what to push, tremendous urgency in getting it done. Country was in a mess, and the Prime Minister of the time, Mr. Narasimha Rao, relied on him.
So why did he become weak and vacillating when he became PM?
Let me explain. The UPA was a very different kind of political combination than the Congress government under Mr. Narasimha Rao. I mean, I mentioned in the book that, first of all, as a coalition, within it, the Congress was weaker. And secondly, within the Congress, he was not the political leader of the party. Mrs. Gandhi was the political, and that was explicitly stated that the political leadership is being given by Mrs. Gandhi. He's going to run the government. So that is a substantially different kind of position, and he has to accept those constraints. Now, you could argue that you shouldn't accept those constraints. I don't agree with that at all. I mean, I think, for example, that accepting those constraints, he was able to do a lot. Let me mention a few things.
No, we've been through what he's done. Let's not go backwards to that.
Well, but
the point you're making, we've been through at great detail the achievements.
On the issue of vacillation, we would never have got the nuclear deal done if he had been a vacillating Prime Minister aware of weakness. He was politically not as strong as a Prime Minister might normally want to be, but on the question of the nuclear deal, he actually managed to get his political leader, Mrs. Gandhi, and the party behind him.
But that is sadly the only instance where he was able to get the political leadership of the Congress party behind him. On many other issues where he had reservations, he had to fall in line either with the thinking of Sonia Gandhi or, more importantly, the thinking of the NAC. But the point you're making is that he seemed weak and he seemed vacillating.
I need to interrupt. Certainly, falling in line with the thinking of Mrs. Gandhi is only appropriate because she's the head of the UPA, she was the head of the Congress party. You keep bringing in the NAC. Well, I just don't believe that the NAC has a similar role.
Let's take those 2 points one by one, and I'll begin by taking up Mrs. Gandhi. Right? Everyone, right through the 10 years, said Manmohan Singh is only Prime Minister in name, real power lies with Sonia Gandhi. And you as much as almost concede that in your book when you say on page 233, that's chapter 12, she was not just the head of the Congress party organization, she was its undisputed political leader, and wait for this, the final decision maker on cabinet positions. Now, appointing people to cabinet and giving them their portfolios is always the prerogative of the Prime Minister. But even you're accepting that Mrs. Gandhi did it. In other words, clearly something that is unconstitutional, that is not considered as part of the Indian system of governance was happening. The Prime Minister couldn't appoint his own cabinet and couldn't give portfolios as he wanted. Sonia Gandhi did it.
No, I mean, you're putting it very differently. The way I see it.
I'm just repeating your words.
No, I said the final decision making. What I mean by that is that the Prime Minister, in constituting the cabinet, would have done it in consultation with Mrs. Gandhi, and I don't think they would have appointed someone which Mrs. Gandhi wasn't happy with. And by the way, if she is the political...
I don't think Mrs. Gandhi should insist on someone the Prime Minister is not happy with. The final word in appointing a cabinet is the PM. Here it's Mrs. Gandhi.
We do not know whether the Prime Minister was unhappy with any of the people.
Well, just a moment. Your words are the final decision maker on cabinet positions is Mrs. Gandhi. It ought to be the PM. That's what the Constitution says.
I mean, the way I put it, what it means is that the PM and Mrs. Gandhi came to an agreement. Now, exactly when, in what cases Mrs. Gandhi persuaded the PM, in what cases the PM persuaded Mrs. Gandhi, I can't say.
Except that when you say the final decision maker is Mrs. Gandhi,
but look,
Mrs. Gandhi prevailed.
She was the head of the Congress party. She was the convener, head of the UPA, including the coalition.
But this was a system that is unconstitutional. This is a system that it is unconstitutional. In our Constitution, and this is the point I want to make, the person who runs the country is the Prime Minister. In the UPA years, the Prime Minister was not the person who ran the country, Mrs. Gandhi was.
No, by the way, as I see it, I mean, the Prime Minister has to take responsibility for running the country. The Prime Minister
But he doesn't have the final power and authority.
No,
that's
but look,
the problem.
No Prime Minister is a dictator. Every Prime Minister consults people. Every Prime Minister...
But the Prime Minister is the one whose final word is the answer. Here, the final word is Mrs. Gandhi's.
I'm not sure you're describing it as if this applies in every single government decision, which I don't think is correct. All I'm saying there is that in constituting the cabinet, and remember, this is not just Congress members of the cabinet, there are other members of the cabinet, the UPA had to adopt a much more consultative approach. I mean, for example, in the cabinet positions given to members of the coalition other than the Congress party, if there was any decision making, that was really the party leaders of
I have an
members that were doing
illustration
it.
of the point I'm making. In an interview to me for the Devil's Advocate program on CNN IBN, Mani Shankar Iyer once said that he was summoned by Mrs. Gandhi and told that she wanted him to be given a particular portfolio. Normally, in our system, in a democracy, it's the Prime Minister who does that. But Mani in public said it, and having said it, he realized he made a mistake and corrected himself, but he went on air. So this is the point I'm making. When you say Sonia Gandhi was the final decision maker, it impinges on the authority of the Prime Minister, which is why, as you say, in circumstances of such, he looked weak and vacillating.
That may have been how he looked, but what I mean is in substance, if you're running a system where the head of the Congress party, for whatever reason, decided not to be part of the government, it's the head of the Congress party who's the head of the UPA. the other members of the coalition looked to her to be the final resolution of inter-party differences. Even the left view her as the head of the coordination committee. The idea that somehow she will have no role in these things is simply implausible.
No one's saying no role. It's the nature of the role and
No,
the impact on the authority and power of the PM. But you disagree.
Well, let me explain. I don't believe that the Prime Minister took on board anybody about whom he ultimately had serious reservations, because then he would have explained that to Mrs. Gandhi. But I have no doubt that, between the two of them...
Oh, well, just a moment.
The whole thing was
just
decided.
a moment. One of the things that is most remembered about the Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, when we look back, is the fact that when he was asked by journalists why he was continuing with A. Raja when clearly the telecom scandal was happening, his answer was coalition dharma.
He's right.
But that's what I'm saying. He was therefore forced into a position where the authority of the Prime Minister was impinged upon and reduced because of coalition dharma. It made him look weak. It made him look as if he wasn't in control of who's in his cabinet, who serves or not. They don't serve at his will. He may want to get rid of them, but he can't, because coalition dharma means he has to keep people who are not right.
But that's you're cleverly putting it in a manner that would make him look weak.
That's how it seemed to the press.
But
that's how it was reported.
But the public and the press must recognize that when you have a coalition of different parties, the Prime Minister in that coalition cannot play the same role that he would if it was a single party government and if he was the head of the party. Now we know that. So that's a realistic appreciation that it is a different kind of situation. I don't think there's anything constitutionally wrong in it at all.
Let me then bring up the question of the National Advisory Council. Now, this was a body set up by the UPA. It was an innovation of the UPA's. But the people who were members owed their allegiance to Sonia Gandhi, not to the Prime Minister. And at least as far as the press was concerned, this body seemed frequently to operate as if it was in opposition or to have a different viewpoint to that of the government. As a result, the government looked weak and undermined. The Prime Minister looked weak. And I ask you this, with hindsight, was the NAC a mistake?
That we have, I didn't directly interact with the NAC except on one or two occasions. On those occasions, and one of them was in connection with the Food Security Act. The Food Security Act, there are many people in the NAC who wanted a much more expansive Food Security Act. The government set it up because I think they realized that there's civil society out there and you need a mechanism, a kind of provide a window for them. So all these civil society members, not all of them, but the ones in the NAC were prominent members of civil society. And they had views on the National Food Security Act.
All of that I understand. You need to give them a certain relevance and a certain window so that they can speak to the government. But what I'm saying is, you ended up with a body that made the government look weak and the PM undermined. Was it a mistake to set it up?
When you say made the government look weak, that's not something that I can comment on. What I can tell you is that the NAC made certain proposals. They came to the Prime Minister through Mrs. Gandhi. They were discussed within government and modified. So what was finally done was actually less than what the NAC had said.
In other words, the NAC didn't have the last word, the government had the last word.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, the Food Security Act was not something invented by the NAC. That was part of their manifesto.
You may be right. You may be right in terms of how the actual relationship between the NAC and the government worked behind closed doors. People don't know the truth. You're the first to mention it. It's not even been mentioned in your book so much. You're mentioning it now in this interview, that in fact the NAC came with this advice, but what was actually formalized in law and accepted was what the government wanted. The government didn't buckle. The NAC had to accept the government has the last word. But let me finish.
By the way, I've mentioned, that's why the book is called Backstage. The specific interaction with the Food Security Act is actually mentioned.
That I know. But there's so many other things. We even had problems earlier over NREGA, where what the NAC was suggesting and proposing was different to what you accepted. But you've made it clear that where there were differences...
And we moderated that.
You moderated, the government had its way. The problem is that as far as the Indian people were concerned, right through those years, 2004 to 2014, those 10 years, is that people thought as a result of the NAC, as a result of the fact that Sonia Gandhi was the woman who mattered, not Manmohan Singh, that the PM was a puppet. That was a word used repeatedly. And this strengthened what the BJP was claiming. It lent credibility to their charge that real power lies in 10 Janpath, not in 7 Racecourse Road as it was then known.
You know, I feel that in a world in which the coalition is a political reality, you can always sort of keep yearning for concentration of power in the hands of the Prime Minister. There's nothing wrong with running a coalition which actually listens to a lot of people.
But that's very different to the situation we had. I'm not saying there should be a concentration of powers in the Prime Minister making him a dictator. I'm saying at least let the Prime Minister retain the powers and prerogatives that are his. Those, even in this instance, diminished and went somewhere else. That's why he looked like a puppet.
No, what he looked like is what you and the others may have perceived. But what I'm saying is that when stuff came in from the NAC, it came in on issues which the government explicitly felt it needed civil society input into. It went into the government. We didn't simply take it as a diktat and do what was needed. It was modified, in my view, sensibly. In fact, I've said in the book that I feel the Food Security Act, we should have modified it even more.
Absolutely.
So there are differences. And, you know, somewhere or the other, the line gets drawn.
Let me then end by putting this to you. Do you believe Dr. Manmohan Singh had the leadership qualities needed to be Prime Minister?
I think he had just the right qualities to fill that role in that particular environment. And as I mentioned to you earlier, when you're in that environment, you cannot constantly sort of want to be a final decision maker when there are different views. Where he thought it mattered in the national interest, which is the nuclear deal, he did stick by his position in spite of very substantial opposition, and Mrs. Gandhi backed him.
You're saying
I mean, he wouldn't have, the nuclear deal would not have happened if Mrs. Gandhi had not backed
you
it.
phrased yourself very cleverly. You said you believe Dr. Manmohan Singh had the right qualities for the position in which he was put in that environment, which means in an environment where real power and the final word rests with Sonia Gandhi, where you have a coalition and your coalition partners will determine who gets into cabinet from their parties, he had the right qualities to handle that sort of delicate prime ministership. A Pranab Mukherjee, who would have been more assertive, more decisive, would perhaps have been the wrong one because he might not have been so malleable either to his coalition partners and certainly not to Sonia Gandhi. That's what you're saying.
No, I didn't mention Pranab Mukherjee at
But I
all.
used him as
brought
an
him into the
illustration.
conversation. No, I'm not expressing any view on who else might have performed the same role.
I'll tell you why I asked you this question about the Prime Minister's leadership qualities, because at the time when he was PM, people said repeatedly that Dr. Manmohan Singh was a brilliant finance minister and that he would always make a very good number 2 in government, but he wasn't suited to be number 1.
You know, I think the nature of the situation was that his position then was a unique position. It wasn't a number 1 type of position. He needed to be in an environment where, on the one hand, he had to deal with coalition partners. On the other hand, his own political leader was Mrs. Gandhi. And he took this job knowingly. I mean, you know, there was a lot of controversy on whether the division of power would work or not work. So I would say that, look, in the first 7 years of that government, if they delivered 8.4% growth, lifted 138 million people out of poverty, improved health, completely abolished polio, and got the nuclear deal done, that's a hell of an achievement.
And you're also saying that a more assertive Prime Minister would not have fitted into this role because he was not pushy, because he was happy to accept Sonia as his political leader, because he was happy to be cooperative with his allies. He had the qualities necessary for surviving in that difficult environment.
No, you're making it sound like a survival strategy. Look, if he was only interested in survival, he could have stopped using political capital on the nuclear deal. On the nuclear deal, the left abandoned the government. There was a lot of unhappiness within the party, as is well known by different sections. I think he perceived that it was in the nation's interest, and I'm amazed that the nuclear deal was wrongly presented as if it was an attempt to get close to the United States. The fact is that the nuclear deal was one which allowed us to use the strength of the United States to get a waiver from the nuclear suppliers group, which enabled us to lift all the technology restrictions that had been imposed on India.
Which was so much more important than just the narrow nuclear window.
And
but again,
that is entirely due to Manmohan Singh.
Absolutely.
I mean,
But as
minus
you say-
Manmohan
as you say,
Singh,
it
it
was
wouldn't have
wrongly-
happened.
As you say, it was wrongly presented, and that's also due to the government, that they didn't open up the country to the fact that this was so much more than just a nuclear deal. It was making India
Well-
open to technology that otherwise would have been denied.
All of these points were made, but I agree with you. Look,
Not effectively.
persuading a large and highly diverse, and as Amartya Sen says, an argumentative country is a full-time job. We should have done a better job on that. But
My
in the
last
nuclear deal,
question.
he completely disproved what you're saying about him in terms of leadership.
In that one instance, yes, no doubt. My last question. Dr. Manmohan Singh has always said that history will be kinder to him than his contemporaries. Do you agree with that?
Oh, entirely. Partly for the reasons that I've pointed out. Somehow, the way the system was projected, the achievements of that government, with all its political weaknesses, were not adequately appreciated.
Except there's
really-
one problem. If he doesn't leave behind his own account of what he did, history may not have the wherewithal to be kinder.
Well, that's absolutely right, and I say in my book that, he should do that, but he's absolutely refused to do it. And I told him that when he says history will be kinder to me, he was actually quoting Winston Churchill. But Churchill went on to say, because I intend to write it myself. So, I mean, I think
And
it'd be
if
great if he were to
if
write it.
Dr. Manmohan Singh really wants to emulate Churchill, he ought to write it too.
Oh, I certainly think he ought to write his book. No question about that.
Montek Singh Ahluwalia, a pleasure speaking to you.
Thanks, Karan. Bye-bye.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.